First and foremost, Hans started with e4, which he usually does. Magnus responded with c5. I may add as context that in the first game they drew their match, so it was half to half, and now this is the second game. Niemann played knight f3, knight c6, and bishop b5 to Rossolimo. Magnus then went on to play e5, knight c3, and d6. Now Hans dropped his bishop back to c4. This is a line, it's a rather fighting line, and it's really good for blitz. Bishop e7, d3, knight f6, h3, preventing the bishop from going to g4. Carlsen castled short, and Niemann played a very unusual move, knight h2. Now, the idea is to go knight g4, trade the knight, and then have the open file for the rook. And in combination with this bishop on this long diagonal, black king could get into trouble quite quickly. However, Magnus Carlsen paired this idea of knight g4 with the move bishop e6, because if he is able to trade off the light squared bishop of white, the black king will suffer no mating attack whatsoever. So Niemann played knight g4 as that's the only logical move to play. He went knight h2, so might as well go knight h4. Knight d4 by Magnus, centralizing the knight. It's given a question mark by the engine, but it's not really relevant. h4 makes sense. You want to prevent all b5 shenanigans, especially with the knight protecting the b5 square. Also, when black plays a6, you might as well go a5 to completely block off the queen side for forever, because you can just take en passant. However, then Magnus played a6, intending b5 anyway, and Niemann went knight f6. After bishop f6, he went knight d5. Of course, if now black trades, white has very strong bishop here, which is quite hard to get rid of. The only way to get rid of would be knight e6, for example knight c7, but that's too long of a plan. So Magnus played b5, which was given a question mark, and in the live broadcast it was also visible on Carlsen's mind that this was simply an error because white can take. And after bishop d2, white is just simply better because black has an isolated pawn on a6, and if black were to take with the pawn, there would be rook a8, queen a8, knight f6, and the king is completely open. The queen doesn't have access yet, but after take and check, for example, the king is wide open. You don't even have to play queen g4. Engine recommends c3, yes, because after knight moves you can play queen g4 and pick up this pawn, and king f7, queen h5. The king is way too weak. Bishop can join. Long castle, rook lift. The position is busted for black. So that's the reason why you can't take a b5, and you have to take knight b5. After bishop d2, simple development move, maybe intending c3 as well to block the knight from going to d4. Carlsen played bishop g4, intending to trying to trade off the bishop. As you might see, the bishop isn't really doing much here. A plan for black might be f5. This bishop also blocks the f5 advance, so it makes sense to trade it off. Bishop g5, and Niemann plays bishop a5, not wanting to trade the bishops. and after queen b8 he castles short. So if you now take a look at this position, it is clear that white is better. Simply to the pawn structure, the pawn on a6 is a weakness. It's not a passed pawn because there's a pawn on b2. So it's simply a weakness. The knight on d5 is very strong. The knight on b5 can get strong if he manages to land on d4, but after simple c3 it has to go back. So that's not really an option. And the bishop on g5 looks good, but it's not really doing much. White has no intention of putting a queen or a rook on any of these squares, so it's not really usable, and maybe even a weakness when white intends to play f4 with tempo on the bishop. So Carlsen plays king h8, stepping out of any potential bishop attacks, also looming at playing f5. Niemann goes queen h5, attacking the bishop, and placing the queen opposite the king. Potential attacking ideas with f4 are in the air, bishop d2, maybe somehow rerouting the bishop, although that's not really a plan yet, but it's a very activating move and a good square for the queen in general. So Carlsen goes bishop d8, trying to trade off the bishop because white has more space, and potentially a bigger idea of attacking with some rook lifts in the future. So it makes sense to trade off pieces. Niemann obliges. He doesn't have to. He could have gone to d2. I don't know his reasoning for trading the bishop, to be honest. But he did it. Queen takes, and now the f4 break, which I mentioned, which I've mentioned quite a lot by now. And Carlsen plays f6. Now it is to be said, if you play ef4, there is rook f4, rook h4, and the situation for the black king doesn't really look good. I mean, you can try to trade off and maybe go h6, but well, you can't go h6 because he's hanging, but the position is really dry and really hard to play for black. White is an easy plan, double on the f file, put pressure on f7. If you play f6, it weakens the light squares even more. There are potential mating attacks and sacrifice looming in the air, so taking is a risky option. So Carlsen plays f6 and intends, if he takes, which Niemann does, you can't take with the f-pawn, because after rook f8, queen f8, there is knight b6, attacking the rook and the bishop, and after rook e8 there's bishop e6, rook e6, and rook takes a6, white being up a pawn. Now granted, there is maybe some counter-attacking chances, but even after a simple queen e2, which is not the best move, but everything is covered, all the entry squares is covered, and white has an active rook and an extra pawn. So that's why you can take with the f-pawn because of the sequence which we saw, and he has to take with the e-pawn, with the d-pawn, sorry. So Niemann goes on to play king h2, does a prophylaxis move, maybe containing g4, although not so sure about that one. Just getting the king out of this long diagonal, which can get dangerous in some scenarios. The queen maybe sneaking in and something, but it's also a move that just a fast move, and it's a good move in Blitz. If you can see here on the clock, 52 seconds. You have to play quick moves, and it's just a quick move which doesn't blunder anything, should improve your position, although the engine disagrees, and you can blitz it out quickly, even though it took 30 seconds. Okay, so he surely had another reason behind this. Carlsen plays knight d6, makes sense. The knight on b5 was not doing too much. On d6 it has more attacking prospects, maybe rerouting via f7, attacking the bishop, maybe you want to take, maybe not. So Carlsen played, Niemann plays b3, and then if you take with the knight, there's bc4, and this is a very, although it's double pawns on a d file, this pawn structure is very solid. With a c4 you have a diamond structure. Pass pawn is looks very good for white, so Carlsen doesn't take the bishop. Also this bishop is currently not doing too much, and therefore it doesn't really make a lot of sense to trade it off. So he plays instead a5, makes sense, the pawn was attacked twice, you can protect it. And after knight c3, Carlsen then decides to trade off the bishop. He could have also taken with his bishop, but after bc or dc4, the knight's very strong knight's outpost. This pawn could become weak, but with a queen move, maybe even rook move, the knight on d5 is very strong, and the knight on d6 doesn't have a lot of prospects of getting into the position. He maybe want to go to f5, but would have to reroute quite a lot to get there, so that's not really an option. So he takes with the knight and leaves himself with the bishop, and then goes on to play queen d2. This is also, you have to take a look at the clock, 13 seconds, that's not a lot. And there is no real option to defend then both the knight and the pawn. So therefore he plays knight a4. If you take this pawn, I take this pawn. That's also what happens in the game. And after a bishop retreat to f7, the queen goes to d1, trying to trade off the queens. Also, furthermore protecting b3 if black declines a queen trade with maybe queen c3, which is not a really good move, but it's an option. However, Carlsen trades the queens. Rook fd1 makes sense. The a rook wants to stay in the a file because of the a5 pawn. And after rook b8, which intends to attack the b3 pawn, leaving the knight with no movement, because if you move the knight, for example, b3 just drops. So Niemann plays a quick and strong move, rook a3, protect the pawn forever, and also keep an eye on the a5 pawn. Carlsen then goes on to play rook c8, which is considered to be a mistake from the engine, but if you look at the time, 9 seconds, 12 seconds, they have 2-second increment, it splits. You can't really expect too much. Also the nerves are high, so keep that in mind. Knight b7, strong move, takes the knight away from rook attack, attacks a5 as well. And after rook ab8, he goes knight d6, forking these two pieces. Rook c7 is forced. Well, there could be also rook f8, but that's really passive. And the a5 pawn simply hangs. Instead of playing rook b8, he could have played h5, or king g8, but there's no real way of defending the a5 pawn. So instead of trying to search for some funky solution like Magnus Carlsen did, he should have just brought his king closer and tried then to play with a pawn down in the endgame and trying to hold it with king f8, bring the king somehow. It's very scary, and probably would have lost this way too, because the two passed pawns are just going up the board and white should win, but that's would have been objectively the best chance he had. But instead he drops a5 pawn, rook b5, want to trade off the rook. If you take c takes or knight takes, doesn't matter that much, both are completely winning, two passed pawns, strong rook which can switch open to any file. The king is not doing too much, but he doesn't have to, because these pawns are just rolling, so obviously Magnus Carlsen does not trade. And after knight f7, king f7, white should have a winning endgame, but it's not too sure. Now, knight f7 is a mistake, but you have to understand that when you leave the knight and the bishop on, the game gets more random. But if you trade off, it's a very simple game to play, and only white can play for the win. So I'm sure Niemann knew that knight f7 was generally not the greatest option, but it was an easy option and making the game a lot easier to play, and also enabling Niemann to play for two results only, namely for a win or for a draw. So it's a low risk move, but it's a safe move. King a7 and c5 makes sense to push the pawns. It's given in accuracy, but it's complicated to understand why Engine wants rook d2, stopping the infiltration of the other rook and stopping any counterplay somehow. But with so little time on the clock, it's a reasonable move. c5, rook a2. Also, another idea of rook d2 was to stop black from going rook b2 and putting his rook behind the pawn. So b4, rook b2, and rook b8. Ancient wanted rook c1. Yeah, I mean, there are also some tactics, because for example, if you were to play king g3, there are, not in this exact moment, but sometimes ideas of sacking the rook because this pawn is pinned due to this pin. And this is also ultimately what Niemann blunders. He plays rook b8, blundering rook takes c5, which Carlsen spots. He's an excellent tactician, of course. But the initiative is not over. The black king is a little bit flimsy. The pawns are weak with the two strong rooks. It gets messy. White, according to the engine, should still be winning, but it's a total mess now. King e6, which is a big blunder, leaving his pawn up for grabs. He should have gone to g6. Maybe he was scared of rook g8, double attacking this pawn, penetrating the black king. Also, the rook is still hanging, keep that in mind. So maybe after a rook c2 there are potential winners. Made in 1, king g5 doesn't look too nice, so that's why he went king e6, trying to gain king activity. And after rook takes g7, he plays rook c6, b5, attacking the rook. This time, for example, you make a random move, bc6 does work, because this is a completely winning rook in game. If the king tries to cross and take the pawns, the white king has already made enough advancements towards this king. For example, king g3, king d6, king h4, rook takes, completely winning king pawn in game. But Carlsen blunders, plays rook d6, suffocating his own king. The white pawn takes away d5 and f5. The white rook on g7 takes away all these squares, and now the black rook takes away the last square, and Niemann finds the maiden 1, rook e8, and the game is over. Now, in the live footage, it was obvious that Carlsen was furious when this happened, but he then went on to win 2 games in a row against Niemann and win some more against his following opponents. But this is a topic I will cover in another video. So thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.